Occasionally, people ask themselves or their peers, I know from my experience having conversations in the past, whether or not the, for example, Christian Zionist extreme right wing movement, which was going nuclear during the Reagan administration, is rational or not. And it's important to understand that the instinct to dismiss these movements as irrational stems from not so much controversy about their faith in the world's magic coming from Allah or anything like that. In other words, it's not theological. Theology has a long distinguished history that everybody recognizes. It's more whether the outcome of exclusion, the puppet show of business as usual, the sight of politicians getting down on their knees and praying at the knees of Donald Trump is a rational phenomenon or not. It seems to many people to be deranged and irrational, and that's the end of the matter. It seems to me, however, that it is a deeply rational phenomenon. You might contradict that with knowledge of them. They have arrived at the doctrine that civilization is the realization that one man's pleasure is another man's pain. In other words, causing pain to experience pleasure is inherently rational civilization. That's their view. Most of you, like me, went to a school where there were science advanced Jews who got scholarships to go to Princeton. They're almost a cartoon stereotype, Dilton doilies like Stephen Langer, who went to Princeton, who make their proficiency in science. They understand mitosis and they are excellent at experimental representation of photon particles. So their science, Einstein went to Princeton, taught at Princeton. So the science of these Jewish aristocrats of intellectuality on which our society leans have arrived at the conclusion in civilization is taking pleasure in other people's pain. And there is a certain rationality to this. Don Toon, President Toon, sees the world as virtually not functioning from the point of view of schools. In the whole idea of a sex-crazed, duplicitous and corrupt society on the make for money. It's the engine that keeps everything going. And this crowd look at, for example, the ugliness of sex and answer with poison rather than home economics classes. So you have a tragic situation based on the idea that science has proven that the totality of civilization is generating pain to experience pleasure. Well, isn't that rational? It's structured in the force of capitalism, making money. And they have these pyromaniacs setting off gargantuan fireworks displays by blowing up their billion-dollar rockets and holding people in awe. Now, one of their adjunct philosophies is Paul McCartney. You see, I grew up in the 70s when there were a couple of boneheaded um, pikers of progress rock who were experimenting with the idea that, or selling the idea that was very widely touted by their fan base, that the powers of God surmount the powers of the devil. So that they could go around playing heavy metal and still get their boots shined outside of British Parliament, Whitehall. And it's juvenile stuff. But they worked with the VA in keeping a Taliban, a list of girls who cooperated, from the magic show of comprehensive family resources to run up a tab on people who they experimented on with scientific nerve agents generating pain for their own pleasure, and then compensating supposedly with pleasure pain principles by knocking off abortions and calling it the walrus, which is what they did to me. And the idea was that this was a John Lennon script. And the only person who was found guilty in supposedly the murder of John Lennon was the person who didn't know anything about it and would never have gone along with it. And that's because that's the person who a rational society would consider a second victim. And they don't want anybody to make money off of the crime that they put so much scientific learning into. So it is rational. And the soullessness of the judiciary comes out in this. I was rendered virtually invisible by the cheap thrill of the allegation that I could have saved John Lennon. Let's talk about momentarily about what might seem to be rationality in the face of this barrage. It might seem to be rational to say that Black Panthers threatening, as a matter of principle, with Yoko Ono to blow up their own children in Seattle with a nuclear bomb is not rational. But they say it's a paradigm against the deaf white suck who's trying to make a penny. And that's so it is rational what they're doing, and it's irrational to accuse the judiciary of being absolutely soulless, which they are, absolutely soulless. They kept me alone for 34 years on ignoramus charges. Now, that they never even advised me of. Now, you have this slogan that comes out of Abdul Eisenstadt. You know the history of Pittsburgh. You know that was an IDF warrior who called himself Abdul the terrorist and pretended to be Palestinian on KDK radio. His slogan was "No one is innocent." You hear the Hebes, I mean the Goodleys, Jewish ears saying no one is innocent all the time, because innocence would mean freedom from the obligation to provide pleasure by accepting suffering and the burying children alive. Horrible things that they're doing. And you would think that that would be the opposite of civilization, anybody with any sense. Scientifically, that is barbarianism. In the 40s, under Roosevelt's administration, that was recognized as barbarianism. Herbert Agar, the editor of the Southern Review, had a book called A Time for Greatness where he spelled out the difference between civilization and barbarism. So they've changed that. And you're not supposed to admit that that's irrational, because it isn't. It's rational process of empowerment by money. Paul McCartney's Beatlenomics are the same principle as Christian Zionism. That is the principle of pushing everything towards self-destruction to cause the maximum amount of pleasure so you can get the last laugh over the idea that the world was put here to be pretty, to have harvests, to have flowers in the spring, to make the children laugh, to have home economics in public schools. So the soulless judiciary surely goes marching onward. And in rendering me invisible, they kept me in absolute isolation. They poached me. They're engaged in a housejacking operation here over the last licks of Medicaid support. And they've given me Parkinson's. They purposefully castrated someone who they purposefully deafened, and then have the gall to put me under surveillance while they bait me with one of their lecture circuits about the inner light because they're connected to the stooge system around the Carousel Club that included John Lennon, who killed JFK. Now, if, when I say include John Lennon, I lose everybody. And there I am back. It's the invisible person. But let's talk for 1 minute about what rationality is. Rationality is rational questions being answered. If we didn't have a soul, I mean, I'm not saying that there is such a thing in our society. Our judiciary is soulless. And if you think it's not soulless, just give it up. You're going to end up sobbing on the curb if you don't think our judiciary is soulless. It is soulless. It absolutely is. I'll prove it with a couple of rational questions. Why, if John Lennon was really killed by the people who I didn't know had anything to do with it, are they blaming the only person who didn't know rather than the people who did it? That's a rational question, but not to a soulless judiciary. That is an affront to a soulless judiciary. And that's Seattle. Seattle sees that as an affront. They banned me from school for 12 years. They punished me with Parkinson's. The list goes on. Why, if John Lennon's team is so concerned about him, his post-mortem, presumed, supposed, scripted post-mortem, because it's all scripted. It all came from Hollywood. It's not an experiment, Jimmy, in subverting reality with illusion. It is. But you can't tell that to a soulless judiciary. Why does the woman who wrote the script appear on one of his honky-tonk redneck insinuators, not record from 1979? 79. He supposedly died in 1980, and they're promoting this girl in 79. Why is she seen in a 20-foot mural playing violin in Seattle Center? Those are rational questions, but not to a soulless judiciary. To a soulless judiciary like Seattle has, those questions are an affront. You'll end up on the curb sobbing if you believe otherwise.